Oh, hello. Hi, thank you for coming, everybody. My name is Amos Latteier, and I'm going to give you a short talk on the subject of getting organized. I've been trying to get organized. I've been trying to organize this talk, and I want to talk to you about how hard it is to get organized, but also some of the really kind of fun things about getting organized. So let's begin. What is organization? Organization is a wonderful and heroic, but also kind of a fascist thing. And the way I want to come at it, there's so many different things. I've been thinking about getting organized, and I've just been having a lot of trouble just getting flooded with all these different ideas about how to organize things that for this talk, for you tonight, I'm going to use sort of two ways into this idea of getting organized, two ways to help me get organized. And one way is to think about games and having fun. And number two is to try to use the alphabet. I had all these things I wanted to talk to you about, and it was going to be like a speech that was going to be 6 or 8 or 10 hours long. So I decided to just alphabetize everything, and we'll just go through from A to Z. But we're going to start with B, because if you're paying close attention, you'd notice we already did A. And this being Portland, Portland starts with Burnside, not Ankeny, so that's a good precedent. And finally, the Bible begins with Beth, not Aleph. The Talmudic scholars out there know that, and that's a good reason to begin with B. So what's B? Aha. B is fantasy basketball. I have been how many people out there play fantasy basketball? Can I just ask? Or any other fantasy sport? I see 1, 2, a couple people. I've been learning about this really exciting and strange game called fantasy basketball. And what it's about is about pretending that you are the manager of a professional sports team. And then you and your other friends pretend that, and then you figure out which players, like you say, Shaquille O'Neal's on my team, and the other person says, no way, Rasheed Wallace is on my team. And then you tally up how many, whatever points and rebounds that they get, and then at the end of the week you determine by reading, those sports pages they have in the newspaper with all those columns of statistics, then you figure out who won. So it's a fascinating sort of blend of real and imaginary, right? You are the imaginary leader of a team, but the sort of battles that you have with your teammates are based on these real statistics that you read in the paper. Let's go on to slide C. One of the things that's really interesting about fantasy basketball, and I think a lot of other games, is how it's a fantasy of management. If you think about it, when you're playing fantasy basketball, you're not pretending that you're a wonderful athlete or a beautiful person or someone who's doing exciting, great things. You're pretending that you're sitting in an office managing a business, right? That's what it's about. It's pretending that you're doing the same thing you might even actually be doing at work every day. It's kind of a weird type of fantasy, a weird type of fun. But as I got into the subject of organization and started researching it more and thinking about it to give you this talk, I realized I think that this type of fun is way more prevalent than we think of normally. I think that this type of fun, pretending that you're a manager or you're organizing things, is much more representative of games in general than we normally think. So let's go on to slide D. Just real briefly, since we're talking about games, I think it's worth defining what a game is. What is a game? A game is a system that's defined by rules. It's not about freedom or play or pleasure or fantasy. A game is a system of rules, and that's sort of what distinguishes it from real life, right? Because real life, there aren't really rules, or at least people don't know what they are. Or if if you did know what they are, that probably means, you know, you're like in prison or like a member of a really strict religious order, something like that. So you've got rules that govern your life. And in those cases, then your life is kind of like a game, right? You're trying to avoid punishments, you know, and accumulate points or whatever, something like that. So that's sort of what defines a game. Games in general, you know, I think are about a certain type of organization, certain type of management, certain type of rules. And those rules are articulated, players operate within those rules. And I have some other sort of example games up here, some that I've played from time to time in my life, like chess and fencing. And, you know, when I was a high schooler, I got excited about fencing. I went to the YMCA and I thought we were going to get to like fight people with swords, but it turns out there's a whole grammar of it. You know, you don't get to just hit someone with a sword. You have to do this move, then they do that move, then you do this move. It's really, it's a game. It's their rules, there's a grammar. If you deviate from those, you're not playing the game, you're not fencing. You're not participating in that activity. And I think you could, if you think of example games that you engage in, you could probably come up also with lists of rules or sort of realize about how those games are in many ways about rules rather than a sort of free-floating kind of pleasure. So let's go on when the computer's ready for slide E. Here we are, slide E. You know, passing from rules, I think, you know, we sort of define games as these sort of rule-following systems, but it's really kind of fascinating that, like, pleasure might be a byproduct of following rules. At least for me, that was a weird realization to make. That's not like the first thing I think of when I think of pleasure, when I think of an activity that I want to participate in. But it turns out it seems like it is really connected. And at least in the case of fantasy basketball, it's not just following rules, but it's about a sort of constellation of management and measurement and kind of organization in general that are all sort of participating in this type of pleasurable activity. So as I am researching these different things and finding out about these different exciting games, it occurs to me, you know, where does this come from? How is it that pleasure is connected with organization? And that's really sort of what this talk is trying to be about tonight. So I thought, well, the first thing to do to try to figure this stuff out is maybe go do a little history. So let's move on to slide F. Slide F. I've been studying statistics. Statistics are really fascinating, and they're, you know, this field of sort of proto-organization that I think can teach us a lot. How did statistics start? Well, it turns out that in the 19th century, there was this explosion of information gathering across Europe. There were government censuses for the sort of first time on a large, coordinated scale, and also private individuals would go around and travel from country to country, not, you know, take in the sites, but they would go to the churches and gather information and publish them in books and stuff like that. So it was really a time that people were first sort of measuring on a large scale, first sort of organizing their countries. And why did they do this? It wasn't really theoretical like it is today, the way nowadays statistics is how we think about what truth is or what things really happen. But at that time, it was way more pragmatic. It was more about how many people do we have, so can we tax them? Can we recruit them into the army? Can we set the price of insurance? It's important to have statistics about when people die in different you know, professions, stuff like that. So this is sort of the first places where people are really getting organized. And when we move on to slide G here, we'll see there's a really kind of fascinating parallel between fantasy basketball and running a 19th century European state, I think. You know, in both cases, what's going on? You're competing with other people. You're gathering statistics on your sort of local population. You're allocating resources. Do I trade Rashid? Do I keep him? And then you're sort of planning and sort of setting immigration, warfare, budget, all these different things as a sort of system of competition and sort of pleasure, right? I think that was probably a really exciting game for those dukes and people like that back at that time. So let's go on to slide H. I think the first thing you think of when you make these sort of comparisons is you're like, okay, the pleasure of fantasy basketball, the pleasure of these organizational systems is that it's about power, right? It's just like running a state. You've got people, you send them into war, they do your bidding. But as sort of appealing, and there's some truth to that, right? It's pleasurable to have power over people, but I don't think that's all of what it's about. I think that there's a more and different and kind of more subtle kind of pleasure happening in a lot of games. For example, the management that you do in fantasy basketball or in a lot of these other games is not really a real management. You're not actually sending people into war. As a matter of fact, those pro ball players have no idea that they're on your fantasy team. They don't care. It doesn't affect their lives in any way. You don't actually have any control over them. And you could maybe, there's lots of other organizational games that are the same way, like Scrabble, you're organizing words and letters, but you don't have real control over those words and letters. It's an abstract kind of organizational control. Or maybe think of even a more abstract one like, say, Tetris, right? That's a game where you're managing geometrical shapes and you're trying to line them up into the places where they fit, and that gives you a certain pleasure to make them all fit together the right way and they move along. But that's not really about having any kind of real control over the world at all. That's an incredibly abstract idea of organization. SimCity, of course, too, is another example of that. So let's go on to the next slide here. I'm going to have to skip a few letters, actually, because really, at the rate I've been going, you'll be here all night, and I know your time is valuable, and plus I couldn't think of anything too good for these letters, so let's go on. Okay, so we sort of set the stage. The next thing that I want to do is look at some more in-depth, kind of more sinister kind of organizational games. And those are, when this opossum moves off here, you can see those are pornography, gambling, and the SAT test. That's one of my favorite. I've really been doing a lot of research on the SAT. If you have questions about it afterwards, I'd be happy to talk to you. So let's go on to slide P, pornography. There's a lot to say about pornography, but I'm going to just give you a few highlights. I want to tell you about my very, very favorite piece of pornography, which is a book called The Atlas of Men. And that was published in about 1954 by this Harvard professor, William Sheldon. And he was an amazing guy. This guy had vision. He, for about, 30 or 40 years, photographed college students naked. He went around to the Ivy Leagues and to other schools and got people to line up like this. Actually, their hands were out a little, and took naked pictures of them and developed all these really fascinating and frankly erotic theories of organization about them. He had this whole system whereby different body types were correlated with different personality types. And you're probably, you could probably do this yourself on the back of an envelope pretty easily. Skinny people are intellectual and nervous, and fat people are jolly, and muscly people are decisive, good leaders probably, something like that. And but my favorite thing about his system is he also had an animal, sort of a spirit animal that went with each different type of body that sort of represented that personality and that body type as well. So let me just show you a few images from that so you get a sense of what's going on. Here's a description of one of those body types. And let me read you a few of these, because they're really poetic, I think, in his book. Next to all the example photos, he would give short vignettes about these different animal body types. Like the kiwis, little kiwis, long-legged, long-necked, frail-winged, but fat-bodied fellows, harmless and inoffensive to all, but the natural prey of everything with a taste for meat. And then big hounds was another group of men. Big hounds, deer hounds, wolfhounds, bloodhounds, all of them heavier, stronger, more endomorphic. That's a technical term. Endomorph, ectomorph, and mesomorph were his sort of 3 axes of body sort of size or sort of function. More endomorphic than greyhounds and taller, more ectomorphic than foxhounds. They grow fat and lazy with disuse. So they maybe weren't quite as good as some other ones. And then, how about the stingless mosquito? Little male mosquitoes, frail waifs of the night air, almost helpless, and they cannot even sting. And then finally, great bears, grizzly bears, first cousins of the mesomorphic royalty, or the royalty grown heavier and lazier, having lost some of its taste for fresh meat, and now eating mainly more easily captured things like roots and berries. So not only is there like an animal, but each animal is sort of described in terms of whether it's eaten or whether it eats other animals. I think it's a truly exciting system. And if you're interested, you can go check this book out of the library. It's on reserve down there at the Central Library. I highly recommend it. It's a great book. You can't bring it home, but you can look at it in the library. Anyway, so I think that this example, the Atlas of Men, is a really great way of seeing how there's really actual, real sexual pleasure involved in organization, in management, in measurement. And you could probably think of other examples of that that you've run into, like men rating women on a 1 to 10 scale as they're like hanging out on the side of the street, or the same thing happens in figure skating or other events like that, right? People are rated, and that's exciting, and you can sort of look at them, and that we could do all night on that. But another great example, I think, is the Marquis de Sade's 120 Days of Sodom, which is an amazing book full of really horrible descriptions of sex acts. But what's exciting about it is that it's organized to the hilt. It's like a symphony of sexual perversion, where everything has a very specific place. There's specific words that you're allowed to use to describe specific sex acts. Like in one chapter, they can be a certain amount explicit, in the next chapter more, and it's all, it's really fascinating. It was also written when he was in prison on these scraps of paper, so he didn't really have time to perfect his whole system. And there's, at least in the edition I have, there are notes about how he's like, must be 40 sex acts in this chapter, yet I have 41. Must go back if I have time when the guards aren't looking, and find where I made a mistake and put one sex act out of place. Anyway, another great book worth checking out. But let's move on to Q. I'm going to take some liberties with Q. This looks a lot like Q. But I do want to talk about gambling. Gambling, I think, is a great, exciting organizational game. It's sort of interesting because it's a game, it's a parasitic game. It's a game that only exists because there's another organizational game that it operates with respect to, or out of sort of friction between these two games, you get the pleasure. And that other game is the game of money, of exchange, right? Money is a system whereby we rank and sort of measure all sorts of, everything, goods and services and lives and things like that, and set them up one against another so that we can exchange them and allocate them to people. And then gambling is a system that's about breaking those rules, about trying to produce a kind of unequal exchange, trying to get something for nothing, if you will. And that's what makes it really exciting, right? Is that you've got rules for breaking rules. That's great. It's not like revolution or theft or burning money or something like that, where you're just totally destroying the rules and saying, forget this money game, we've got another game, or we've got another total, doing away with the rules. It's a controlled game that has very specific rules. You go to Vegas or whatever, or even other types of less formal gambling. There's very specific rules about how things happen that can allow you to break these other rules. So we could spend, again, more time on that, but let's move on to R. For R, I want to talk about the SAT test, which is another kind of sinister game of organization and management. And let's start, just to sort of put things in perspective, I want to give you a little brief history of the SAT, and then we'll move on to talking about how it works in terms of pleasure in just a sec. The SAT test comes, like every modern intelligence test, from the Stanford Binet intelligence test that was developed at Stanford in, I think, about the 20s, something like that. And that, in turn, was a refinement of Alfred Binet's mental age scale, which was another turn-of-the-century real early way of testing intelligence. It wasn't about college students. That was for elementary school students to see who needed a little extra help. And that, incidentally, is where the idea of IQ comes from, right? He had this idea that you could rate someone as having this 10-year-old as the mental age of a 15-year-old or a 5-year-old or something like that, right? So if you've got the mental age of a 15-year-old, divide that by your true age of 10, that gives you an IQ of 150. And that's still used today. That still has a lot of sway in places like Mensa or whatever. Anyway, so this SAT originally sort of was assumed, or sort of designed to test ability, whatever that is, which was assumed to be kind of innate, unchanging, and then possibly also heritable. Or in other words, if you and your spouse have a high IQ, then you'll have kids who have high IQ. Or if you and your spouse have low IQ, your kids will have low IQ. And that, again, that's another topic we could spend a lot of time talking on. There's a lot of really objectionable history that resulted from that. Basically, people saying, well, the upper classes are that way because they're smart, they'll always stay that way. The lower classes are that way because they're dumb, they'll always stay that way. And of course, lots of sort of sly variations on that, that even to this day still haven't died out. There's still, like the bell curve or whatever. People still sort of kind of believe that maybe if you're on top, maybe you kind of deserve it, Maybe you are kind of smarter. Maybe you did trick the person out of that money because, you deserve it on some level. Anyway, the evolution of the word SAT, or this phrase, has kind of mirrored this sort of this development from a sort of more starting out kind of crude scholastic achievement test to then later on it was changed to say scholastic assessment test, which to me doesn't make sense. That's like it's a test or something like that. And then finally today, SAT is just 3 letters. It doesn't actually mean anything if you look into it now. But let's move on to letter S. Letter S, so why are we talking about the SAT? How is it a game? Well, it's a game in the sense that it's about organizing things for pleasure, like organizing all of knowledge and ability, if you think about it, sort of grouping it all down and distilling the essence of it, and then organizing all people, or at least all people who want to go to college, on this sort of graduated scale about how much, they are sort of indexed to this knowledge. So that's an exciting and really grand organizational system, but you might say, well, Amos, that doesn't sound like a game to me. I took the SAT test and it was not very fun at all. I don't think it's a good game. I agree with you. It is not very fun, but I think the key is to realize that the students are not the players of that game. They are they're the people, the waiters, the bus people, the support staff of that game. The people who are playing that game are the people who run the tests, who define the tests. ETS is a private nonprofit company that does that, has a monopoly on that. And also, to a certain extent, college admissions officers or politicians, to the extent that they're interested in the SAT tests and sort of get to play with the results and think about it and get excited about it. Those are the people who are having the fun. It's not the people who are taking the test who are having the fun. So we're going to come back to this idea of a support staff for a game in a few slides, but let's continue on to slide T. For slide T, I just want to show you a picture of a toad. I drew this picture, I really liked it, but again, I just couldn't really think of anything to say for this, so let's move on. Okay, for slide U, okay, now I want to maybe switch gears just a little bit and maybe get a little more analytical and give less examples. And I think I kind of been running down games like the SAT especially and some of those other games, but I think it's important to realize that there are wonderful and heroic and valuable and useful things that these sort of organizational systems have. Like, the periodic table, for example. That's a great way of organizing all matter in the universe onto this little square chart. That is vision. And it's actually useful. You are able to, with that way of understanding how the world is put together, you can do things that you couldn't do without that type of understanding. Or, the color wheel. That might be a useful thing to you painters out there, at least when you're learning about things. I found another wheel that I was really excited about recently, or actually this was a little while ago. I was in a grocery store and I noticed in the wine section they had the aroma wheel, which lists all the different smells in the world on it. A really wonderful way of organizing every different type of sensation, at least a smell or taste sensation you could have, and putting one next to another so you could know that garlic was adjacent to wet dog, was adjacent to, whatever else. Really exciting and visionary way of thinking about the world of taste, but of course completely broken, not viable in any particular way, but beautiful, I think. And that's, I think, one of the, let's see here. My second point that I want to make also is that in addition to that, organizational games on a much more sort of mundane, non-heroic, non-exciting level do provide a lot of comfort and consolation for people, like doing the dishes or cleaning up or knitting or meditation. All these are ways of organizing your little space and just feeling more at ease and more comfortable with yourself and the world around you. And I don't think that's bad. I don't think that's for sissies. I don't think, there's something wrong with wanting to organize your world. I think that's good, and that does provide a true and valuable type of pleasure for people. And then finally, when this gets back up here, I just want to say I think one of the greatest pleasures in these sort of organizational games, or ones that I like the most, are organizational systems that are so beautiful and huge and all-encompassing that they're must, by their sort of very definition, completely fail. Like the city of Brasilia, for example. Has anyone out here been to Brasilia before? Okay, you've heard of Brasilia though, right? It's the capital of Brazil, an amazing city built from scratch. So viewed from the sky, it looks like an airplane or a flying bird. Everyone who lives there, their address is their X and Y coordinates. It's an amazing system of organizing people, but of course it's totally flawed and inhuman and unworkable. I've met a number of people who've lived there and they're like, you go crazy there. It's like living in a dollhouse or something like that. And there's apparently no sidewalks, at least through much of the part of the city. So it's a real visionary, wonderful way of organizing people, but pretty broken. Also similar to this total information awareness database, you've probably heard of that. That was another wonderful idea about how we could organize all the citizens, or maybe even all the people in the world. And if we got all the information on all the people and the government collected it all together, somehow we would know who the terrorists were. And that's a nice idea because terrorism is scary and it would be nice to be able to stop it. And that's a fascinating idea that you could do that. But of course, it's totally unworkable, both politically, because people would never consent to that sort of Big Brother kind of thing, at least not knowingly. But also, it wouldn't actually help you do anything to have all that information. How would you know who the terrorists were if you knew every action that every person had ever taken? It would be impossible. That's not what we need. We don't need all this information. We need analysis, or something. I don't know what we need, but we don't need this scheme that organizational games have is that people forget that they're games. They start taking them too seriously. And that has a lot of bad consequences, right? You've got a whole organizational game worked out. It's working really well for you. It seems to be operating right. But then you get more invested in it, and the bad things start happening. People start sort of mistaking a system that's about pleasure for a system that's about controlling the world or controlling other people. And I think intelligence testing, or the SAT is a good example of that. It was originally this sort of you know, the SAT was sort of broadly adopted. Again, this came from Harvard, this president of Harvard, I think, again, around the turn of the century, was like, we need to increase diversity at Harvard. We need to get Midwestern men here. That was their idea of diversity at the time. But that was it. That was a good idea, and they were going to have a lot of people participate in this game and, you know, get them in and bring them around. But they started then sort of more believing that it wasn't about fun, it wasn't about changing things and bringing new things about. It was more about actually seeing something real in people. And they started sort of mistaking this, this power of their game, or the way their game all fit together really well, for some sort of truth, right? There's what I mean up here on this second bullet point when you see it, reification of ordering principle. What I mean by that is that it's easy to mistake accuracy for validity, right? Just because you can do something really precisely and really well doesn't mean that it's reflecting reality, that it's about truth, that it's having some real purchase on what's happening. And that's a flaw. That's a kind of a subtle point, but that's a flaw that happens in all sorts of organizational games. So let's move on to slide W. For this, I want to mention just another way in which organizational games go bad or kind of get worn down. You know, the last slide we said people sometimes take them too seriously. Another problem that they have is that they get boring, they get old. People stop having fun, not because they're too serious, but just because it's a routine, just because it's the habit. You know, that's no good. Like you could think of, you know, I don't know, well, let's do the next point and then I'll go on to example. A sort of allied point of that is that sometimes as things get habitual and boring and worn down, there get to be less and less people who are really playing, less and less people who are having fun, and more people who are sort of in charge of supporting this game, being the support staff, being the people who allow this game for this sort of smaller, dwindling number of people happening. And I think a great example of that is representative democracy, like we have here. That's a game that's gotten really boring. I mean, it's not fun to vote. People don't vote because it's not exciting. You don't have interesting choices. You don't feel like you're really playing. It's just like, it's just habit, and a lot of people don't even bother. The people who are enjoying that game, who are having fun, are a very small group of people, like the people who are running for office, or the people who are, I don't know, lobbying those people, or things like that. So it's a game that at once has both gotten old and boring. Maybe it never really was exciting, but at least that's what they say, that it was maybe more exciting earlier on. And in addition, the amount of people who are having any pleasure about it is shrinking, and more people are there supporting this game. So that's another way I think that games can get run down, things that are sort of originally about pleasure and excitement of organizing all these things together and maybe coming up with a new way of sort of seeing the world and lining things up, can just really get kind of less interesting and more tedious. So I would like to just sort of wrap up now by putting these last three letters all together here, X, Y, Z. You know, I guess to sort of summarize what I've been trying to say, I would say, number one, try to enjoy the organizational games you're involved in. The systems of putting things together and organizing them, that's great. You should try to find exciting things about that and try to see ways in which the world is being organized that are fun and beautiful and exciting and tragically flawed as well. And number two, XYZ not only just means the end, but at least when I was going to elementary school and people said XYZ to you, that meant examine your zipper. And so I would, that meant maybe you should be paying attention to what you're doing. So I'd say for bullet point number two here, maybe pay attention a little bit to some of those organizational systems you're involved in. And I've given you a few sort of practical tips that you could use, like are your organizational systems fun? If not, well, that's maybe not so good. And Are you organizing people for their own good? Do you imagine that this game is not about pleasure, but it's actually about controlling real things in the real world? If so, you might want to try to find another game, or might want to try to revise that game in some way or another. And then finally, these last 2 bullet points, I guess I would just, we've just been talking about playing games and sort of observing them, but I think some of the most fun that you can have in the world of organization is in inventing your own games or changing the ones that you're involved in. So as you're looking at these games, as you're trying to have more fun in them, trying to see where they've gotten old and boring, maybe think about rule changes that you might want to introduce, or maybe even think about a whole other way of organizing things that might give you and maybe more people more fun than the games you're currently playing. Thank you. That's all I've got for you tonight.